Okay, enough commercials. Elaine Ruffolo really needs a little introduction. A legend in her own lifetime in Florence, been around for 20 odd years, longer, a little less, a little less. Graduate of the famous Syracuse and Florence program, and now art historian at large around town and all over the world. And tonight she's going to tell us all about feasting in the relations. Thank you. Oh, and yeah, okay, go.
Nice to see all of you. Welcome, everyone, to my presentation. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Simon. It's good to see longtime friends and new acquaintances. And a big shout out to those of you who are tuning in on Zoom. Super excited about this talk because I am kicking off the holiday season. And I'm doing it with the appropriate theme, something that we are all going to be partaking in these next few weeks, and that is feasting. How much feasting? And how much feasting was going on in the Renaissance. So we are going to take a look at the following. I'm going to organize this presentation as follows. We're going to look at the role of food in the Renaissance, what's on the menu, where meals were enjoyed, the art of feasting, and food as symbolism. So it's quite a dense talk. I'm going to go pretty fast, and I have beautiful images to show all of you. So let's jump right into it. And we take a look immediately because as Italy entered into the Renaissance, dining evolved into a more refined and a kind of sophisticated experience. So lords were no longer eating with their vassals. Instead, they became established courts where dining became a symbol of power and status. This is the period that we started to see the onset of table manners, reflecting a growing emphasis on etiquette and decorum. Think about global trade routes, which became firmly established, bringing in all these new ingredients and influences from lands far, far away, long, long ago. Foods from the New World. I mean, think about it. Tomatoes, chocolate, they all started to make their way to European kitchens. Sugar became a coveted luxury and something, of course, that was transforming sweets into confections and extravagant desserts, spices, cinnamon. All of this was, of course, reflecting wealth and privilege. Now, that is a big contrast to the food or the thought of eating in the Middle Ages, where the whole idea of food was deeply focused on the notion of balancing food against your individual temperament. And this was developed under the ancients, a guy named Galen and Hippocrates, and it's referred to as the humoral diet, exceedingly complex. So we're all made up of the following humors: phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood. Yuck. You ate in a precise way because you always wanted to keep those humors in balance. And, you know, if you think about it for a minute, I guess we still have some of those old vestiges. You know, the saying, feed a fever, starve a cold, or is it starve a fever, feed a cold? I can't remember. Or for the Italians, we say mangiare in bianco, eat in white, and that gets everything balanced out. And that's how people thought about things in the Middle Ages. So by the time we get into especially the latter part of the Renaissance, taste began to shift from spices, which could be quite cloying. You know, the spices were oftentimes used to mask the smell or the rancidness of meats or what have you. So away from spices and acids to a new richness. Sugar became prevalent. Butter and oil was used to thicken sauces. And something else to consider was the onset of the printing press. So the date of the printing press is 1436. By the time we get to the middle and end of the 15th century, books are being printed, including cookbooks. And this is a famous one from the end of the 16th century, Bartolomeo Scoppi's cookbook. And it spread ideas of these noble chefs all around Europe. Italian life, of course, is played out at the table. There is this wonderful Italian proverb, a tavola non si invecchia mai, which means at the table, you never grow old. Do you feel that way? I always feel younger at the table. And, during the Renaissance, food was the epicenter of daily life. It played a significant role in art, society, and think about it further, food is also involved in religious ceremonies, holidays, weddings, childbirth, all those things. And really, this idea of life lived around the table, as you can see from the 16th century Italian, has not changed very much. The only thing that's different, I bet you can all guess, there's not so many kids at the Italian table anymore, that's for sure. So all of this, in a tavola non si invecchia mai. Okay, so let's get down to it. How were they preparing these foods? What was being brought in? And the key city for this period is going to be Venice. So Venice opened the door to the use of spices, and it brought in through Venetian ports from the Middle East, through the port of Venice. They would put a tax on it, and then the spices would be sold throughout Northern Europe and Italy. Pepper was the most common spice. After pepper was clove, nutmeg, ginger, cinnamon, cardamom. All of that became plentiful thanks to Venice. And it's interesting because where did you go to acquire these spices? And the answer is the apothecaries. So if you look on me, here, I'll get in a little closer for you guys. You can see up here in the upper left-hand side, that's a Venetian apothecary spice trader. I love this image. And this is where you would go if you needed to buy some medicine, maybe syrup, ink, dyes, paper, paints, cosmetics, sugar, and spices, always at the apothecaries. So basically it went like this. If you wanted to get something that was sold in bulk, like say rice, right, you would go to the grocers. Then if you wanted something fresh foods, you would go like fish and vegetables. Of course, you would go to the open market. But if you wanted something small and expensive and rare, or was supposed to be consumed for medical or health reasons, you went to the apothecaries. And that's why they're, in fact, in Florence, one of the major guilds in Florence is the Apothecaries Guild. So which spices were consumed in the Renaissance? Again, black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, clove, cardamom, coriander, ginger, something called mace, which I don't know what that is, saffron, and sage. Those are the kind of spices that they were using. Someone can fill me in later, whatever mace is. And all right, now, what did they eat exactly? So food turned out to be this major differentiator between the noble and the peasant class. However, both classes depended on two things, bread and wine. Of course, bread was the main source of calories for the poor, but it was also enjoyed by the wealthy. Brown bread was common, but white bread was more expensive, therefore for the nobility. If the bread was made from mixed grains, it was suitable for the poorest families. The wealthier liked to have pastries, pies, fritters. And if any of you are from the United States, you might remember growing up with a particularly ghastly kind of bread called Wonder Bread. Remember that? Yeah, terrific. That's what it's all just so completely changed now. Then, of course, we've got wine. And wine was the common denominator because grapevines are easily grown all over Italy. Even peasants would make their own wine. However, it's not the kind of wine that we enjoy so much today by the Camponi or the Frescobaldi or the Antinori. Instead, it was a kind of wine that was probably not very pleasant, so much so that it was diluted with water and diluted with ice if you were nobility, or you could flavor it with spices such as honey or even licorice to take away the taste of the bad wine. And wine was drunk by children and adults. They believed that water could be suspect. So if you mix it up with wine, you might have a better chance of drinking something that wasn't full of germs. Although interesting, another point, like these two images, the nobility up on the upper left by Lorenzo Lotto, and this fabulous painting by Luca Giordano from the 17th century of the pasta eater. Isn't he delightful? So they believe that rich and poor should eat differently because of their physical makeup. A Bolognese doctor in 1585 wrote that a rich man's diet would sicken a poor man just as quickly as a poor man's meal would cripple a nobleman. So there was no such thing as the Mediterranean diet keeping you healthy. Yeah, truly. The idea is interesting. The idea was the closer to the ground that food came from, the more suitable it was for the peasants. While food that came from higher places, such as fruit from trees or long-legged animals and birds, were more suitable for the nobility. So in general, the poor are going to eat more foods that are low to the ground or in the ground, such as turnips or garlic or onions or carrots, while the nobility would dine on higher foods such as artichokes, peaches, pheasants, pears, and cherries because they are above ground. Now, no matter what the diet, the nobleman was advised to always practice temperance. Most of you recognize these two images. They're from the Arena Chapel, painted by Giotto, showing us a virtue and a vice. And they're across from each other, and they're meant to be seen in conflict or complement to each other. Temperance and ire, which means anger, losing it. And the nobleman was advised to practice temperance and use great restraint, especially when it came to eating. No overeating, because a merchant's life depended on sobriety at all times. Otherwise, he was going to make a mistake in computations and make sure that he or miss out on something that he was owed. So too much food was seen as being dangerous because it provoked sloth, sleepiness, and a slow wit. Okay, so now let's go into when and how did people eat? What was the rhythm of the day? In the Middle Ages, 2 meals a day were the most common. The first was taken at noon and the second just before dusk. Now, later on, when the meals were pushed out to accommodate preparation time, they started to add a light breakfast, which would be consumed a little bit of bread and butter and cheese. Italians are still light on breakfast, if you think about it. They don't have a hearty English breakfast. It doesn't ring true here at all. But by the Renaissance, the midday and the evening meals could be quite elaborate, depending on the occasion. So we're talking about banquets, which could also include dancing, entertainment, followed by drinks and dessert. At a banquet, and you're looking at this wonderful scene of a banquet by Jacopo della Cellaio from the late 15th century. This is at the Uffizi. The guests would be provided with first water in a bowl that was scented with roses and a towel to wash their hands before the meal began. Then it was quite common to serve dozens of courses at a fancy banquet. The tables would be layered with many, many tablecloths. And each course, a tablecloth was removed so that you always had a clean slate to provide for the next set of dishes. Can you imagine the ironing and the washing? The courses could sometimes be as many as 100 dishes each. A banquet for a pope or a prince might include, 1,000 dishes throughout the meals. And not everybody was served the same dish. The most luxurious dishes, which would be something like pheasants gilded with gold, or rare meat such as turkey at the time was quite a delicacy. It was known as an Indian peacock, and that would be reserved for the very most important people at the table. The setting at the table, as you can see from this close-up of the nozze di cana here, was not dissimilar to what we have today. Plates, a spoon, and a knife, but it wasn't until the end of the 1500s that the fork became commonplace at the Italian table. So let's say a few words about the fork. We know the fork was used in antiquity. There were forks in ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, but they didn't use the fork for bringing food into your mouth. They used the fork for holding meat while carving or lifting it from pots or the fire. The fork was brought to Europe from the court of Byzantium in the 7th century. That's the first time we hear about a fork. There was a princess who married the son of a doge in the 7th century. The Venetians were suspicious of her. They didn't trust her, and she was denounced because she was using this strange implement. One clergyman said, "God in his wisdom has already provided us with forks. They're called fingers." 2 years later, the princess died of plague, so the proof is in the pudding for sure. So the fork gained its 5 tines in about the 1100s, and by the 1500s, the fork was commonplace for eating. Nobility also carried toothpicks, and this extraordinarily beautiful object on your right-hand side, which is today at the Medici Treasures Museum at the Palazzo Pitti. Can anybody guess what that is? It's a toothpick, which is fantastic. Toothpick that could be made of gold or silver. They were often threaded with a long chain and used in this decorative holder. You can see this lady in this beautiful painting by Tiepolo, she's picking delicately at her teeth. And that was considered the utmost in good manners, to pick your teeth at the table. Okay, so now you've got the idea of place settings. Now, what about rooms? How did that all work out? And I've always found this interesting. We've all been to the Palazzo Davanzati, right? So which one's the dining room? Yeah, it's impossible to figure out because dining in an upper class household in the late Middle Ages, like the Palazzo Davanzati or the Palazzo Horn here in Florence, would take place in the same room as they were referred to as salone, which simply means big room or large room. So the table would be set up for meals and then taken down, collapsible, and the room would be transformed into a dining room. That's why you don't see specific dining rooms, say, so to speak, at the Palazzo Davanzati. But about 1400, we start to see the designation of a specific room in which dining began to take shape. And by the time we get to, well, this is a 17th century image, which is absolutely beautiful, that shows you the elaborate development of a dining room. Villas, palaces would have these dining rooms called salas. The walls were hung with beautiful painting. The ceilings were painted. And if you look over to the right of the painting, you can see that there's a room so that the servants would have easy access to bring food in and out. And then in the distance, you have an open loggia to bring in fresh air. By the way, this is painted by Jan Bruegel the Elder and Peter Paul Rubens. They combined, and it's called The Five Senses. So they collaborated, and it's a perfect kind of marriage between Bruegel's mastery of detail and still life and Rubens' skill in painting these figures. And it's part of a series representing the five senses, where each sense is depicted through these elaborate symbolic imagery: the sense of touch, the sense of sight, sound with musical instruments, and of course, the sense of taste with food. I mean, beautiful. And that's the kind of refinement we get in the 17th century. Nice dining room. Speaking of dining rooms, wealthy nobility started to incorporate outdoor dining in their villas. And this is an example in Rome. It's known as the Villa Farnesina. And it was built by the banker, who was the papal banker, Agostino Chigi. And he developed this beautiful villa right along the Tiber River. And it has this now the loggia you're looking at is filled with glass, but when it was originally constructed, it was an open loggia. Therefore, you could eat inside or you could continue out into the garden to eat. I mean, it's a wonderful example. This is what, 1512 or so, 1514. It's a wonderful example of an indoor-outdoor space. And it's perfect for dining in Rome on a hot summer evening. So Agostino Chigi turned to his favorite painter, Raphael, to decorate the ceilings with frescoes. He's painted this fictive tapestry that would hang above your head as you're eating, and it gave the guests something to delight in as they were dining. And oftentimes, well, you can see, what better place to dine than underneath all these naked gods and goddesses, right? I mean, I know this is the papal banker and the Pope would come to dinner very often, but I defy you to find one religious image in the whole bunch. Anzi, it takes over the top. They'll fill little details. Everything is titillating. Everything is exciting. And that's what you look up at as you're dining. Now, he also had a lovely dining area built outside, as I mentioned, on top of a natural grotto, especially on hot summer nights. And there's a particular story that I always remember. He threw this big dinner party for the Pope. He gave everybody gold and silver plates to dine on. And at the end of the dinner, he dramatically took the gold and silver plates and threw them into the Tiber River, as if he was so wealthy he didn't care about it. But little did they know that they had rigged up a net underneath the river and pulled all the great story, isn't it? So that's how they would dine So just giving you an example, I was finding all these recounts of the kind of dishes and what things were going on. There was this big celebration for the first year of Pope Pius IV's reign, and there were no less than 1,167 dishes planned for the celebration. 10 courses, sweet and savory dishes all at one time. I think this is interesting too. There was no idea of the dessert after dinner. Sweet went together with savory, so you'd have a sweet pastry alongside a boiled rabbit or a boiled fish. Okay, and a common dish in the 16th century were sugar sculptures. I don't know if any of you remember the show at the Palazzo Pitti in 2015. Anybody go to that show? They had this fabulous show where they recreated these unique sculptures that are all made of sugar, water, and gum arabic. And this is taken from that show in 2015. They would make these they were called tablescapes. And the diners would come in and admire. Here's a nice detail for you. Venus coming out of the bath. Then you can also see a lion attacking a bull, also a bull. And this lion and bull sculpture, I mean, these are now recreations, but we know what they look like. They were used during a proxy wedding feast between Maria de' Medici and Henri IV of France. And this love of sugar sculpture spread throughout Europe, and it really all started in Florence. So banquets could last for hours. So what are you going to do besides looking up at naked gods and goddesses? You got to have some kind of entertainment that was needed to keep the guests occupied for those hours. And most noble courts employed or owned little people, in Italian called nani, N-A-N-I. And they were often given to other households as gifts, or they were traded between courtly families. Even the Pope had a little person for entertainment. And here you can see the nano on this. They're especially prevalent in the north. These nani were both considered, they were natural buffoons because of their looks, and they were used as gestures for entertainment during a feast. It's all so politically incorrect and horrible, but that's what they would do. In addition to buffoons, of course, you're going to have jesters, nani, buffoons, and musical accompaniment. played between courses. They would even have acrobats, belly dancers, and fireworks. And believe it or not, I've got proof because here's the image. In a wonderful banquet for Christina of Lorraine and Ferdinando de' Medici, they threw a mock naval battle in the courtyard of the Palazzo Pitti. I mean, can you imagine anything more over the top? They filled the courtyard of the Palazzo Pitti with water, and they had a naval battle between the Christians and the Turks. Wow, it's called a naumachia, and this is an engraving of that whole event. All right, so now let's talk about the delivery of food. That was really part of the entertainment. There was a person called the trinciante, or the head meat carver. He was front and center at the banquet. His role as head meat carver was especially important because he was a master swordsman. He had to know how to carve exotic birds. He had to be able to throw meat in the air and cut it up and bring it down so that it would fall perfectly on a plate. I think I've seen that on some kind of a YouTube video or something. There were occasions where the bird might fly out of a pie. And there is a 16th century description of the trinciante coming out with his wagon of meat being pulled by 2 jaguars. All of this fantastic subject matter for fantastic feasting in the Renaissance. Now let's turn, now you got the idea of what these banquets were like and when they were taken, where they were taken, what the table setting was like. Now let's turn to specific representations of food and feasting in the Renaissance, which can reference the divine, the secular. It can represent greed. It can show rowdy behavior, fertility, or it can just be the satisfaction of having a good meal. I mean, from the pear that's held by the baby Jesus, an apple that's tempted by Eve, a chicken that's offered by a lusty maid, or even an old woman cooking eggs. This practice of depicting food begins in antiquity and continues into the Renaissance. Let's go back to one of the first images of food in antiquity. Isn't that fabulous? This is known as the unswept floor, and it comes from Hadrian's villa in Tivoli. Today it's at the Vatican. And next time you go to the Vatican, I know we all go to see the Sistine Chapel and those wonderful things, but do take a moment to look at these because they're just fabulous. And it is done in mosaic, one of the first examples of what's called trompe-l'œil, or fool the eye, where they very carefully, using mosaic, tried to give you the feeling that this floor is completely littered with the scraps from a meal. I can see fish bones, fruit pits, nut shells, scraps. Let me get in a little bit closer for you so you can see the shadow. Isn't that extraordinary? And therefore, the diners would walk over this mosaic floor and feel as if they had to avoid walking over the pit or the wishbone. And so, like the antiquity, the Renaissance picks up on this love of trying to make it absolutely realistic. And the artists are going to take increasing inspiration from the natural world. And they start to depict objects such as fruit or sweet or wine vessels or flora or fauna within these devotional imagery. I mean, this is an impeccably painted image. This is from the Brera in Milan. It's really showing off the artist's observation, his skill in depicting shape and texture. And then, of course, there's oftentimes symbolism to it. But let's stay with antiquity for a moment. The symbolism of food and drink is fascinating because it has its roots in mythology. So fruit, nuts, herbs, grain, they're all found, of course, mentioned in classical treatises on farming. But they're also attributes to the gods. And some of these are easy lobs. I mean, what's the attribute of Dionysus? Wine, of course. And there we've got Caravaggio picking that up. Over on the left-hand side, this is a beautiful painting. It's in Parma, done by the artist Correggio. And he's painted with trompe-l'œil, fool the eye, in grisaille, so it looks like a sculpture, up in a niche. Look at this is a dining room. You can tell because I can see these rams that are holding a tablecloth, holding plates. See it? And then up above, I see a woman who's holding a cornucopia, and she has sheaths of wheat. So that's going to be, of course, Ceres, who is the goddess of the harvest, looking back again at classical antiquity. Then you start to see a mixing up from mythology and religious art. So religious texts are very rich in symbolism of food. And the pomegranate must be the best example of a fruit that is both pagan as well as religious. So the pomegranate is associated immediately with Persephone. And I'm sure many of you have seen this famous statue by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. It's at the Villa Borghese in Rome, and it's called The Rape of Persephone. There's Hades who's dragging her down. Her mother Ceres was distraught. She turned the world into permanent winter until she could find her daughter. Hades said she's free to leave if she wants. However, she had eaten seeds from a pomegranate, which guaranteed that she had to return to her horrible husband 6 months out of the year, and 6 months out of the year she could be with her mother, hence the seasons. They're using a pomegranate to explain the natural phenomenon of the seasons, and that is mythological. Whereas the pomegranate in Christian art, which we see all over, especially at the Uffizi, represents the blood of Christ, or sometimes represents the Trinity, because a pomegranate is divided into 3 parts. There's the outer marrow, there's the shell, and then the inside, which are the kernels representing the blood of Christ. I mean, no wonder why we see so many pomegranates in Renaissance art. Now, of course, the most recognizable and widely used fruit in art is the apple. The Latin word for apple and evil is the same thing, malum, because the apple was associated with the tree of knowledge, of course, from which Eve ate the forbidden fruit. Isn't that an amazing detail? This is by Luca Cranach. It's again at the Borghese. And you can just see the little teeth marks that Eve has made, clearly showing us that she's eaten from the forbidden fruit. She and that snake at the top are having a kind of agreement. And that is one of the first meals, of course. And Jesus is frequently depicted with an apple to show his role as redeemer. I mean, truly, the apple is the role of good and evil. It's not just apples, but there's lots of other fruit. This is by Carlo Crivelli at the Metropolitan in New York. And just, I'll get in close for you just for a moment because the detail here is fabulous. Look at that. The blush on the peaches, the lovely leaves. He's depicting this extraordinary painting, and he does a festoon of apples and gourds. Now, I think they look more like pickles than gourds, but it's a gourd because God caused a gourd to grow over Jonah's head, and God caused a gourd to grow over the Holy Family on their flight into Egypt. That's why you find pickles in these religious works of art. 17th century, still life paintings are going to flourish. Especially in Italy and the Netherlands, and Caravaggio's famous musician. You can see a Cupid over on the left-hand side who is just picking some grapes here. Why grapes in this case? Not this time for Bacchus, but because music was invented to keep the spirits up and keep the spirits happy, as does wine, which we'll find out after my lecture. And especially in the 17th century, expensive delicacies, shellfish, lemons, games were all associated with a privileged life. So you want to have this kind of imagery. So it's really fascinating to trace the images of food from antiquity all the way to the 17th century, and also note how they tend to overlap. Okay, now let's come to towards the end of this presentation, with my last category because I wanted to look at different types of meals that are shown in the Renaissance, including miracles, mythology, marriage and childbirth, genre scenes, and fantasies. These are the last categories I wanted to show you with this extravaganza. And of course, I go to the beginning, which is miraculous and biblical scenes. And it all begins, of course, with Adam and Eve. The very first reference to food is in the Old Testament, particularly in the context of eating associated with sin. And of course, that comes from the story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis. The consumption of the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge offered to Eve. Eve offers it to Adam from the tree of knowledge. And of course, it symbolizes disobedience. This is the act that begins original sin and has consequences that are, of course, going to shape many later interpretations of food, morality, temptation. It's the very first and most meaningful meal since creation. Let's stay with the Bible, but now we're in the New Testament. Here's the Last Supper, which is indeed one of the most sacred and iconic moments of the New Testament. This is Jesus's final meal before he is crucified. The event is described by Matthew and Luke, and it marks the institution of the Eucharist, or what we call Holy Communion. Jesus shares the bread and wine, but it's one of the most significant moments of the whole Passion of Christ. And this image is the earliest one I know of the Last Supper. And this is in Ravenna. Some of you have seen this with me. We've looked at it together. It is found way at the top of the roof line on the upper right-hand side in a church called Sant Apollinare Nuovo, and it dates back to 545, which is amazing. And the mosaic is a showcase of course, that Byzantine style. These figures are depicted. Can you see there's Christ on the left? We can tell it's Christ because he's wearing purple, and the apostles are fanning out and specifically reclining, because you reclined at, of course, Seder. What are they having for their Seder dinner? Fish, of all things. Let's do another one. Does this look familiar? Yeah. One of the most famous images in art, Christ gesturing towards a glass of wine and a piece of bread. What's he doing? Well, on one level, they're having a dinner party. They're having of course, Seder. Then, of course, he's going to make that terrible announcement that one of you shall betray me. But I think it's fascinating how Leonardo depicts the image of food. So Judas is clutching. There we go. I have a detail here. So I labeled them. So here's Judas. I'm going to go in a little bit closer. Here we go. There. Now, I know it's not in good shape, but if you look carefully, Judas is clutching a money bag with one hand. And with his left hand, he's reaching out. See it? Reaching out, he's going to grab a piece of bread. And then to your right, Christ is doing the same gesture. He too is reaching for the bread. With his right elbow, Judas is knocking over a salt cellar. Right there. I know it's really difficult to see, but they did the restoration, and it seems like he's knocked over a salt shaker near his elbow, which is symbolic of evil, and it still is bad luck today. Wow. What are they eating? The meal is highly unusual because they're not eating bread or wine or fish or whatever you have at Seder. They are eating orange slices and eel. That sounds disgusting, but take a look. That was late. You can see it very clearly. There's a sliced up eel with orange slices. There's the pewterware and bread. And it was one of Leonardo's very favorite dishes. So Leonardo's supper is clear. It's easy to read. I mean, it's not in great shape, It is all about, again, Passover Seder, but he is Leonardo, of course. The painting is a balance of human and divine, a blending of the intimacy of a shared meal with this profound theological theme of sacrifice and betrayal. The opposite is the case of this Last Supper, which is by Paolo Veronese. And there's nothing here that can be read as clear nor concise. Veronese takes the scene of the Last Supper and brings it to the extreme. What the main actors, of course, which should be Christ and the apostles. Can you find them? Takes a minute. There they are, right under the main arch. But they seem to me to be lost with all the other dinner guests. Christ is right there in the center. John the Beloved is on his left, our right. Peter on Christ's right, our left. Possibly Judas alone turning around, but then we kind of get lost in everything else. So they are framed under an enormous central arch. But if I hadn't pointed that out, it takes a while to find them. I'm hard pressed to find the subject. What are all those other figures doing here? I mean, and he throws everything in that you can imagine. There are people who are sipping wine from an unfinished glass. I can see soldiers, people picking their teeth on the right-hand side, dressed in elaborate costume, little people, servants, chubby Germans, everything you can imagine, all shown at this Last Supper. And it was so disturbing that Veronese got in trouble for this, because after all, this was made for a refectory for monks. And the inquisitors caught wind of this. They brought Veronese up on charges of indecency and brought him to trial. He was found guilty, but he didn't change one iota of this beautiful painting, which is, by the way, today at the Accademia in Venice. He just simply changed the name from The Last Supper to Feast in the House of Levi. And that's how he got around it. Feasting in mythology and literature. The great canvas here, I would be amiss if I didn't bring up one of the most famous paintings, Italian paintings in the United States, The Feast of the Gods. This is by the great Giovanni Bellini, and Titian finished it. I love it because there's not all that much feasting going on. There are 6 women, 8 men, there's 2 satyrs, I can see a child. Everything's shown in this fabulous landscape of craggy rocks and cliffs and trees. The colors are fabulous. Has anybody found the food? Where's the food? Right there. Right there in the center. You can see a gorgeous blue and white ceramic dish filled with grapes and small yellow fruits. I think what Titian and Bellini are doing here is showing us the Feast of the Gods, which is pretty meager because, after all, what do the gods live on? They live on ambrosia. They don't need all that food. Oops. There we go. All right, now let's go to this next category. This is literature. The feast was held, this feast, oh, beautiful painting. This is by Giambattista Tiepolo. And this feast was held by Egypt's most powerful queen, Cleopatra. And it was a setting for a famous wager. So there was this looming threat coming over from Egypt. Cleopatra strategized how to get the upper hand over the Romans. She had been the lover of Julius Caesar, who gave her these 2 beautiful, enormous pearl earrings as a gift. Then she was the lover of Mark Antony. Both of them ended up dead, so not a good love match. She wagered with Mark Antony that her fabulous banquet would cost more than 10 million sesterces, which was a vast sum. And even after a succession of the most succulent, rare delicacies, she didn't spend the requisite sum to win the wager. So she had her servant bring her a glass of vinegar. She took off the giant pearl earring, dropped it into vinegar, it dissolved, and she drank it down. That brought the cost of the banquet up to the bet. Tiepolo uses this wonderful story as a way to show attractive elements of physical beauty, a famous queen, and of course, a spectacular feast. Now, when it comes to marriage and childbirth, food was, of course, of all importance. This is a famous image by Sandro Botticelli, a wedding scene showing the wedding between Bernardo Rucellai and Nannina di Medici in 1466. And it took place right in front of the Palazzo Rucellai. I mean, almost straight on from where this, building is. And there were more than 500 guests. Who knows how many gawkers? They had to set up or construct this triangular stage in front of the house that stretched from the Palazzo Rucellai over to the loggia, and everyone had the dinner party outside. It was described as the finest wedding bank, filled with furnishing, and it started on Sunday morning and went till Tuesday evening. 50 cooks, provisions, we had the list, 2,800 loaves of bread, 4,000 wafers, 1,500 eggs, 4,957 chickens, small birds, 700 ducks, fish, tongue, mozzarella, and 120 barrels of wine. I mean, wow, that is a great banquet. And there we are. Now, coming to the end here, childbirth in the 16th century was also significant and important for feasting. Food played a central role in the postpartum care and celebration. So, of course, this is a period that didn't have any kind of modern medical care, to say the least, and giving birth was considered critical, but also quite dangerous. Families would try to take steps to support a new mother. So she'd give birth, and then she'd enter into a period of confinement called lying in, where she stayed in bed for weeks. And during the time, the new mother was brought easily digestible food like broth or stew or sweetened dishes to bring her strength back up and promote healing. Broth especially was considered important because it was comforting and beneficial. And these meals were oftentimes served on the kind of plateware you see on the left and right. Those are bowls, sometimes plates, which are referred to as desco del parto, birthing plates. Not that you gave birth on the plate, but the plate was brought to you. And then they would keep these things as, as gifts and something to symbolize. I especially like the two bowls because the bowls were filled with broth, and then the scenes in the bowls show the woman being brought broth. Okay. Last two examples, genre scenes, particularly in the 16th century. They loved to show images of food. They were very popular in northern Italy, especially in the Netherlands, but also in Italy, especially in Bologna. So I chose these Bolognese artists to show you scenes, I mean, as mundane as a peasant eating beans or butchers who are calling out their wares. These are all Bolognese artists. I guess that's appropriate because Bologna's nickname is Bologna the Fat, so you can see all this wonderful food. And here, this is my favorite example of a genre, and that's done by Annibale Carracci, who's painted The Bean Eater. This is at the Palazzo Colonna in Rome. Hard to find, but if you go, you can find the famous Bean Eater. It can be sort of a journey for you. And he's my favorite because he's a perfect caricature of a peasant. And that means that there is an interest in subject matter that had previously been thought of as unworthy. Look at the details. I'll try to get a little bit closer for you. There we go. And you see the glass is broken, showing us the state of neglect of his home. Look at the presence of a scallion, which is a smelly vegetable, which fits into the whole plebeian context. Look at the rough bread, the missing teeth, the hat that's torn. See the broken glass right here where I don't know if you can see my cursor. No, on the upper left-hand side, not the glass that he's drinking from, the glass plane. And the beans, everybody. Say no more about the beans. Wonderful image. And then finally, we get food fantasies coming up in the 16th century. And I end with this world of nature that provided an infinite source for artists. There was an interest in nature, everything associated with it. And certainly a good example is Giuseppe Arcimboldo, He used the basic elements of still life, fruit, vegetables, animals, so on, to compose these bizarre anthropomorphic images. The constructions look like stylized portraits, but hidden into them is a kind of encyclopedic catalog of nature. I mean, amazing. You look carefully at these details, and the cherry is the eyeball, or a mushroom is the forehead, a gourd is the nose, a pear is the chin. Or look at this one, which is all composed of every kind of fish you can imagine. Mollusks, sea creatures, squid. His portraits remain these cultural artifacts that reflect the Renaissance fascination with a blending of nature and knowledge. They treated nature as both a kind of a muse and a subject, all of this wonderful imagery. So food and feasting in the Renaissance art serve a way that we can explore the interplay of culture and society, from these opulent banquet scenes celebrating abundance and power to humble depictions of daily sustenance. The artists are going to capture the essence of their time, showing us social hierarchy, religious practices, economic reality. And we can gain and appreciate, not only appreciate their artistic brilliance, but also gain this deeper understanding of the culture and symbolism behind food and feasting and art. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you very much, Elaine. That was wonderful as always. And now we can do the usual ritual of question and answers and comments, and with the same rules as always. Put your hand up in the room. Alan's always got his hand up, and I bring you the microphone, and then you make your comment or ask your question. On the Zoom, we'll find the chat, and you can put yourself up on the chat, and we'll hear you, or read you rather. And if you're feeling brave and want to talk to us, you can also unmute yourself, and we'll hear you in the room. So Alan's got a question.
I just want to thank you very much. I enjoyed that very much about symbolic and real problems of eating and things like that. I'm going to mention one thing that really does astound me, and that is, of course, among the, we'll call the nobility or the rich, the monarchy, gout was extremely serious, very widespread, and it was clearly because they ate too much meat from the chase, wild boar, all these meats that they had killed in the chase. I mean, like Henry VIII couldn't walk because of it. And there were stories of bearing this terrible torment of gout. But was there any indication that they knew what caused this?
That's a good, I mean, when you think what I listed, what the wealthy were eating, of course it's gout. Oh my goodness. But they didn't associate it with the food. Think about the Medici, for example. They were famous for being suffering from gout, from Cosimo de' Medici all the way. Yeah, and there was no clear association with what they were eating. They did know, the Medici, that oranges were good for you. They didn't know about vitamin C, but that's one of the reasons why, if you look at the letters written between Nannina and Cosimo, she talks to her husband saying, we've got particularly good oranges that you should try to eat. But I don't think they understood what gout, I mean, it's uric acid, right, in your joints.
Thank you very much.
Sure, no, nice to come.
I'm from Carla on the phone.
Thank you so much. I Google mace. Yeah, it's a very little used spice, similar to marjoram. Majorana in Italian. Marjoram.
Marjoram is mace. There you go. You learned something. The exchange. Yeah, very good. Yeah. I come up for him.
Yeah,
No,
there's one.
rumor. No, we got one on the front there.
While we're coming to the next question, I'll just make a quick comment. Those of you, next time you go to the Palazzo d'Avanzati, go to the top floor in the kitchen, and they have a medieval recipe book that's open. It's a facsimile, and you can see the kind of recipes that people and the kind of things that people were eating in the 14th century.
Were they complicated
No.
recipes? Or?
No, there weren't. It's quite clear. There's also a famous recipe book in Florence called Artusi. Yeah, which gives old recipes as well. Sir.
Okay. Yes. Apart from the list of drugs you have already showed us, I don't know if they used heavy drugs, not only
You mean like opium or?
heavy drugs, not only, I mean, like
medicinal?
like certain kind of mushrooms, or so.
Psychedelic mushrooms.
Yeah.
I don't think they knew about magic mushrooms, but they did use the spices, and especially at the apothecaries, they knew that some of the drugs could have, there's the very famous story of the Bartolini Salimbene family who throw a very big dinner party, and they served all the guests risotto, and they laced all the risotto with opium. And so everybody ate their risotto and boom, fell asleep right in the risotto, except for the Salimbene and the person that they were trying to get the deal from. And that's why if you walk by the Palazzo Salimbene, which is right in front of the Church of Santa Trinita, make sure you do this. There's writing in the windows that says, non dormire, don't fall asleep. And there's a whole scroll of little poppies. What do poppies make? Opium. So in a roundabout way, I'm answering your question because they did know that there were drugs and they could have sleepiness or. Yeah, right. I think oysters, just like today. Yeah, right. There's Gwen.
There's a rebellion coming from the Zoomers who the mace debate is taking a new turn. We have 4 different people asserting that mace is the outer shell of nutmeg, the outer covering of nutmeg, the layer that surrounds the seeds of the nutmeg, and nothing will ever do with marjoram, it seems, unless marjoram is also. Okay. And we've got a longer comment from Gwen Kuber. And I want to shout out for Gwen Kuber because Gwen is our sponsor tonight. Thanks, Gwen. Hey. And I'll just read what Gwen's posted. There's a fascinating article in Smithsonian Magazine last month about an Italian scientist who's been scouring Renaissance paintings, medieval archives, and cloistered orchards. And she's uncovering secrets that could help farmers and governments help combat the growing agricultural crisis and even bring back into cultivation all manner of forgotten fruits.
Yeah, I read that. I think Gwen sent it to me. It's a really interesting article. Fruits that are now extinct, and she's trying to do it. And Gwen is also the one who sent me those pictures of the beautiful sugar table. So she's
so Gwen is heavily involved. Thanks again, Gwen. That's fantastic. Here we fun.
Regarding all the depictions of the Last Supper, and they all had rolls and bread and so forth. If that was supposed to be the Seder, there was never bread. It was always unleavened. It was a matzah. So
and that's a very good comment. It's because the bread and wine represents the body and blood of Christ, even though it doesn't correspond to a Seder, because you wouldn't have bread, you have unleavened bread.
Right.
But it was more important to show the symbolism as bread than to be perfectly correct. Yeah. Yeah, no, they didn't
Thank you.
care. Yeah,
Right.
good comment.
I see Gwen's up there. Gwen, if you'd like to talk to us, feel free to unmute. We'd love to hear your voice. But don't if you don't want to. Okay. The offer was made at the back there.
Here I am. Hi, Elaine. Can you see me?
Great lecture. Thank you. This is sort of a curious question. I was visiting the Bath, and I was visiting the historic house in the semicircle of the Bath circle, and it was given a description that one of the rooms adjacent to the banquet room was selected. It was a large room, looked like a banquet room, selected for the men after the banquet, where they went to smoke their cigars and drink and relieve themselves. And that's why they separated the women out. Given your description of these banquets going on for days, what did they use for bathrooms?
Oh my goodness, I'm afraid I don't know, but I do. I mean, I know what the bathrooms were. In the 14th century, almost no house has a bathroom. It's an outhouse, or it's a chamber pot underneath the bed, or whenever you need it, and then the servants would get rid of it, look out below, throw it out the window. One of the earliest bathrooms is the Palazzo Lanfredini, which is essentially a hole that goes down into the street. It would have been a very, very dirty place. Yeah, things were then, of course, it was a cesspool, and that was all taken to the river at the end. So I'm sure servants would take care of people as they needed, or chamber pots under ladies' big skirts as well. Yeah, we're kind of swept under there. That's about all I know about.
Think of that sign.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more thoughts or questions or interventions on anything to do with the subject? But any more on the comment?
My sister's here. Hi, Lisa.
Okay, that's good. So,
Wonderful. Let's see.
yeah, so Penny Clark. Elaine, a thorough, brilliant talk as ever. Yay. I would be interested in agriculture to follow on from the expansive talk on food. I shall share this with my family.
Yeah, that's I'd like to do that too. That's something I'd like to start to research. That's going to take me a while. I want to talk about Roman treatises on farming. And, you know, it's such an interesting topic because that treatises that they were rediscovered again during the time of Palladio are going to help the farmers who are up in the Veneto looking back at Roman treatises. And all these gentlemen farmers that come out of that period can be correlated to treatises. And then even Tuscany, what was Tuscany like originally? I mean, there were no cypress trees or things that we see today. That's all much later. What was used. So yeah, I will.
And probably fewer vineyards. All right. Any more for any more? I think we might be getting towards the natural time when those in the room go next door for a glass of wine from our seasoned sponsor. But next week it'll be coming to an end. Poggio Torselli have been looking after us well this season. And thanks again once more to Gwen for the sponsorship and interventions, and big thanks to Elaine for a lovely talk.
Oh,
thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, guys. That's it.